Hello and welcome to Overlanders Then and Now. I'm Tom Bingle, and I'm here with my good friend and co-host Jim King. How you doing, Doc?
I'm doing great, Binks. Thanks. I'm really looking forward to revisiting that night back in February of 77 when we made the decision that literally changed our lives. So, why don't you start it
Yeah.
off? How would you describe the decision that we're talking about today?
Jimmy, in a nutshell, February, senior year. And seriously, Jim, we had just finished studying at the library, walked down to our off-campus house and put our books down and went into the tavern, this beat-up tavern, local tavern. But the decision, Jimmy, that night that we discussed was between starting our careers, all right, or doing something that was totally back then completely different. I was all set to go to law school. That's, kind of an accepted path, definitely, but not so much pumped up. And then, Jim, that night, you suggested a possible trip to Europe out of the blue. Well, that really made me think, Jim. Left field. It was so unexpected, Jimmy, and I was a little irritated because I had somewhat of a this path going on.
You're
But for me,
irritated at me?
yes, at you,
Uh,
Jim.
I have that effect on people.
Jimmy. But for me, it became a huge decision. Now, how about you, Doc?
Well, I had a much easier time. Grad school was not on the radar. I,
Okay.
didn't really have very many exciting job prospects. I did have an offer to sell glass bottles across the Midwest. Not exactly what I was looking for. I really wanted to become a writer. So
hmm
when my brother, who was stationed in Europe at the time in the Air Force, invited me to visit him and his family in England, and then see a bit of Europe,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I thought it was a great thing to do. And I almost didn't bring up the idea with you since
Yeah.
you had, already
Yeah.
been accepted to two different law schools. So what changed your mind?
Well, thank God you did, Jimmy. It was deep down inside. I had these memories back in geography class, fifth grade. Jim was my favorite class. Mrs. McGuire introduced us all to the seven continents. Oh, that was pumped up. And then George Perot, a Detroit older gentleman. I don't know if poor George could walk, but he had his friends that did these travel logs and went to Europe, Asia, Africa, whatever. And that just really was still very much a part of me, that exploration. Ran it by my brother, Bill, AKA the Duck, who had started his law firm already. And he said the famous seven words in the blog: you can always go to law school. Decision made. What about you, Doc?
Yeah, that's very similar to what Duck said. A great guy, by the way. Very similar to what my dad told me when I first broached the idea. Yeah, I was worried about falling behind, even though I didn't have any major job prospects. I was worried about falling behind our peers, career-wise. But
Mm-hmm.
I also really wanted to be a writer and gain some experiences. So when I ran the idea by my father about
Yeah.
traveling, he said pretty much what Duck said, except he the way he put it was, you can't do it any younger.
That's good, Jimmy. Great advice. Oh my God, that applies to so many different decisions and life choices, Jim.
Yeah,
I'll
that's
be
true.
darned.
Wow.
Unbelievable, Jimmy. Wow, what great advice.
So were there any factors that made you think twice once you made the decision? Was, back then, was going to Europe such a big deal?
Oh, Jimmy, yes. It was a huge deal. Jimmy, the only one that I knew was my brother BJ headed out with some buds, but for me, the furthest I had ever been in my life was Southern Ontario. And the only impression I walked away from that, Jimmy, was that the hamburgers tasted different. And Jim, we weren't backpackers. We were not campers or hikers. And I never used a school backpack. We always carried our books. I think that you have that same characteristic, Jim. But what about you overall on the decision here, Jim?
Well, the UK part of the trip was a no-brainer, but the
hmm
thought of going solo around Europe, a little bit daunting. So, your decision to join me kind of sealed the deal. Yeah, and the rest, as they say, is
Yeah.
history. It made a huge impact on our lives.
Yeah, very unbelievable, Jimmy. Absolutely. I had a career that lasted for 4 decades in the travel industry, and I never looked back, Jimmy. And yet again, it was so exhilarating. I never felt like I worked a day in my life, and basically doing the same thing, Jim, that what we were doing every day while we were, backpacking. Jimmy, we were exploring and we were presenting the world, to ourselves with the goal, at the end of the day, Jimmy, to make it a smaller place, but and let people make their own impressions. Well, what about your path, Doc? Do you know?
Well, it was different from yours.
Yeah.
Definitely. But I really believe that that decision made in
Mhm.
Nikki's that night, we were overserved, was, that one moment that you look back on and say, that was it.
Yeah.
That decision made all the difference. In my case, as
Yep.
you know, I ran out of money in Bangkok.
Yeah.
So I caught the cheapest flight back to America, which was San Francisco. And I fell in love with the city and I vowed I would never leave it. But
Yeah.
then I was offered a writing job on the East Coast, which made it a very tough decision, but I took the offer.
Yeah.
That's where I met
Hmm.
my wife, and thanks to
Hmm.
her incredible support, not to mention patience, I made the decision to leave my job and become a freelance writer. And that was nearly
Wow,
40
man,
years
that's
ago. We
unbelievable,
have
Doc.
two great kids, three grandkids that we love
Yeah.
spoiling, and none of
Uh-huh.
that would have happened if
Yeah.
I hadn't made that decision
Wow.
back in
Yeah.
South Bend.
Isn't that something, Jimmy?
So let me
Wow.
ask you, Binks,
Yeah.
what advice would you give to people facing, a momentous
Oh,
decision?
Jimmy, interesting question. I think, to go with your gut. Don't always go for the path that everyone is expecting or society is saying that you ought to do. So follow the passion, Jim. That's the key. And it's fascinating, Doc, what happened with me on this during this whole time. It was hard to make it. You had to have some chutzpah in order to make it. But Jim, I got reinforced. I kept getting stronger and stronger with the decision that I made on during all the time we were working to make the money, and just everything started. And I never ever kind of then, well, as I said, it lasted 40 years. What about you, Doc,
Well,
on that?
I think your advice is really spot on. And I like that idea that, when you make the decision and commit to it and start moving forward, you gather strength.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important. You have to be practical, know the pros and cons, but that's, when making a decision, but that's kind of cliche. I think you always need to make decisions that push the envelope a bit,
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
out of your comfort zone. You got to be practical. As you
Yeah,
point out,
yeah.
I think we worked like
Y-
three jobs
Yes. Yes.
each during the summer
Yeah.
before we went. But you got to get out there and expose yourself
Yep.
to
Yep.
new experiences. Another favorite saying
Yeah.
of my father was, "Life is a feast, and most of us are starving." So
Jimmy,
what he was
unbelievable.
telling me was to
Yeah.
get out there and fully experience life, which I
Ah,
think we did.
Jim, that's great advice. Again, your dad. Is there a book of your father's sandwich? Something that we, but Jimmy, you know what? That last one is just what we did with our very first stop, Jim. Ah, gosh. Thank you. I mean, Jimmy, so, here were two boys from Ohio going to the big city on this layover between Cleveland and flying on to London. We had an overnight in New York City,
Mm.
Jimmy. And that was, as I said, it might have been a foreign country. And it was a good test for us to do that, right, Jimmy?
Yeah,
New York
it
City?
was definitely an eye opener for sure. And I'd never been there, so I wasn't quite. This is the '70s, so it
Yeah.
was quite a different city than it is today. But we'll save all that
Yeah.
for our next blog. And
Mhm.
so, if to those who are watching and listening, thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us next time. And
Yes.
until then, cheers, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
We're getting closer on that
Yeah.
cheers, Binks.